Hello and welcome back to Latveria Library, where I talk about all things comics. Today we continue the journey of John Constantine with a new creative team, but same old chain-smoking con man. So like, subscribe, and share if you enjoy the video, and let's just get into it. We left off at the end of Garth Ennis' incredible run, with John in a somewhat good place. He made some mistakes during his war with Satan, but also learned a lot as well about the person he's been, but also who he wants to be and how important his friends actually are. Only time will tell if he keeps on the path he's on. Which brings us to issue 84, a one-shot by the first writer Jamie Delano, that gives us a glimpse into the early days of John and Chaz's friendship. A time when John just had gotten into magic and still didn't really know much. Even so, he was still an incredible con man, maybe even a better one since he didn't have magic to fall back on. But let's just get into the issue and you will see for yourself. It starts with Chaz waiting outside the airport for John, who was now an hour late, which in turn made Chaz late. He was supposed to be at the hospital 30 minutes ago to pick up his wife, daughter, and new grandchild. His first grandchild. What made it even worse was that he was late because of John. His wife hated John for a multitude of reasons, which, if you know John, it was deserved. So this wouldn't make things any better. Fortunately, he would be able to make it up to her. Chaz had decided he would just drop John off at his place to save time, then go and pick up the family. Constantine began to whine about how he needed to be somewhere, until Chaz told him the real reason. Seeing his wife's family around, visiting with the new baby, made him feel, for the lack of a better phrase, left out. John was the closest thing he had to family, and he really wanted him to see the new grandkid. John thought about it for a second, and supposed it wouldn't hurt to spend some time with the kid. As long as Chaz had some booze, of course. It had been a long time since John climbed the steps of this place. He really wasn't excited about going back in there. The place still sent shivers down his spine, and got much worse the moment he opened the door. A familiar sweet dread rippled his heart with excitement, but not in a good way. To calm himself, he began to look for Chaz's secret stash of smokes, then headed upstairs to his old room without even realizing it. He thought old habits really did die hard, or maybe it was just some kind of invisible energy pulling him towards the top of the house, because he found himself climbing to the second flight of stairs, to the room where Queenie, Chase's mother, used to stay. Being up in her room again made him think of the first time he had ever met her, the day he moved in with Chaz. John opened the door to the top floor to introduce himself to Queenie when he got a face full of shit, thanks to her pet monkey, or at least he thought it was the monkey, never could really tell. The two began to roar with laughter as John stood there in shock. Nowadays if that happened, John wouldn't have even flinched, but back then, they were like two demons on amphetamine, nearly stopped John's heart. After they had had their fill, Queenie introduced herself and her pet monkey Slag, as John wiped the poo from his face on a curtain near the bed. He then tried to leave, but Queenie wasn't done with him just yet. She wanted to know where her boy was. John said Chaz was down at the pub, and before he could even finish the thought, Slag was out the door and down the stairs, off to fetch him. This left John with the unfortunate task of finding Queenie's cigarettes that had been lost underneath her. But there was no way in hell he was going anywhere near her, or so he thought. Queenie grabbed his balls and squeezed as hard as she could. She knew that John was going to be a problem. She could see it in his eyes, so she had to put him in his place, remind him whose house this was, and who was in charge. We cut to a little while later. Chaz and John were in the kitchen. Chaz apologized and begins to explain the whole story about how he's basically a prisoner in his mom's house. She had that monkey constantly watching every move he made. Hell, he even tried to run away one time, but the monkey eventually found him. It always did. If he was gone for too long, Slag would wait outside and make so much noise that Chaz would have no other choice but to leave. But it wasn't just when he went out. Even at home the thing tortured him. Once when he had a girl over, and while they were getting intimate, Slag snuck up behind Chaz and jumped on his back. The little psycho was riding him like a cowboy, slapping his ass all while smoking a cigarette. And that's just how it had been ever since his dad had died, or killed by Queenie like Chaz suspected. The monkey was just there one day, which gave his mom no reason to get out of bed, since the monkey could do all the snooping for her. Plus she made pretty decent money with her in-home psychic business, Connecting people with their dead loved ones had always been fairly lucrative. So for 10 years, she's been up in that bed just getting meaner and madder by the day. John suggested putting her in an old folks home, but Chaz was too terrified to go against her. She could just look at him and fill him with fear. She would go into some kind of trance. Ectoplasm would begin seeping out of every hole in her body. If John knew back then what he knew now when it comes to the magical arts, he might have found a better or quicker way to deal with Queenie. But like I said before, he was young and inexperienced. This was the first magical foe he had ever encountered, but he knew he had to help his friend. Plus, friends can always be very useful. It took him a month to figure out a plan. He never did say a word to Chaz, because magic freaked him out. Plus, Constantine couldn't bring himself to ask him to take out his own mom, so he was on his own, and had to take this very slow. Queenie had been suspicious of him since the day he had moved in, and thought if he did do anything, she could easily dispatch him. But unfortunately for her, John was patient and smart. He took his time, ignored her insults, made jokes with her, which was really frustrating. Queenie was so desperate to find John's weakness, she eventually let Slag loose on him. But he expected this. You see, Slag was Queenie's familiar, which meant she was basically a part of her, or maybe symbiotic is a better word, like Venom and Eddie Brock. So taking out Slag would no doubt leave Queenie powerless, but the way he did it was something that was incredibly unexpected. John began to slowly seduce Slag. It started with Slag just saying the most vile stuff you could think of to John. It made him want to vomit, but instead he would smile politely and listen calmly. Eventually, after a couple weeks, this turned to flirting. Unfortunately, this still didn't gain him any trust. The monkey was smarter than he thought, and wouldn't let him get too close, so he ramped it up a bit. John began to grovel, brought her gifts, and started to sob at night, but it was all for naught. The monkey would just sit outside his window, laughing at his quote-unquote misery. It wasn't until he had the idea to lure Slag to the canal. There he professed his love to her, laying it on thicker than he ever had during these past couple months, even going as far as to threaten to drown himself if he couldn't have her. And unbelievably, it worked. Slag finally let down her guard, moved in closer, and regretted it instantly. Constantine grabbed her by the neck and held her down under the water of the canal. He began to squeeze as hard as he could, filling her lungs faster, all the while knowing this was murder. Since Slag was Queenie's familiar, she would be dead before he got home. We then jump back to the present, with John being awoken by Chaz and his family. The ending is basically Constantine meeting Chaz's new grandkid, who to him at least bared a resemblance to a shit-fleeing little ape. John turned to Chaz and made him promise to not let his daughter call the kid Queenie. This was a pretty interesting story. It kind of gives us a glimpse as to why Chaz kind of just takes John wherever he wants, whenever he wants, without question, but never gets involved really, nor is asked to. He never saw it or anything, but knows John had something to do with Queenie's death. It's almost like a known secret that neither speak of. I love getting interesting lore like this from characters, especially when it makes the people around them make more sense. But anyway, let's move on to the next issue, 85, which happens to be the first in Eddie Campbell and one of my favorite artists, Sean Phillips' run. It starts with Constantine answering a call from an old friend. Her uncle had been possessed and needed an exorcism. The man had been a passenger in his own body for years now, but it had gotten much worse recently. So John agreed. He owed this person a favor anyway. She had helped him con many people back in the day. When he arrived, John headed straight upstairs to her uncle's room. He then reached over and put his hand on Uncle Arthur's head, and suddenly the man had some sort of apocalyptic vision. Same vision John had been having. After it was over, the man keeled over and passed away. Obviously, this looked bad for our hero, so instead of waiting around trying to explain what had happened, John opted instead to leave through the window. If only there weren't bars on said window. His only choice now was to leave the way he had come, but got an unexpected surprise when he opened the door. 3 spirits were there to greet him, and if that wasn't weird enough, one was missing her arms and eyes, and one was some sort of cat demon. The 3rd spirit was the first to speak. His name was Francis Dashwood, the founder of the Hellfire Club, which was basically a club for the mega wealthy, where they would get up to more deviant activities away from prying eyes. But that's not really important at the moment. What was? Well, the three spirits needed Constantine's help with conjuring a spell on a massive scale to help fix the deterioration of reality. You can imagine that John was reluctant to help, until he saw they were holding his friends hostage, so he really had no other choice. Accompanied by Dashwood, John headed back to his place before they started their journey to grab a few things. On the way, they ran into a mob destroying everything in their path. Dashwood tells John that it was a collective spirit of a London mob and that this was only the start of Doomsday. There were so many other dangers that Dashwood couldn't even begin to warn him of. All of the gates and doors that has kept everything in place have now been flung open, so they needed to hurry. The two stayed the night at John's flat, and in the morning they headed to the airport, their destination, Philadelphia. Dashwood still hadn't told John what he was supposed to do or look for. The ghost was being pretty vague about it all, which was never a good sign. But there did seem to be a connection to urban legends. For example, the vision John had was of a chicken giving birth to a human head. Or while they were on the plane to America, the pilot played a joke, pretending to be a drunk passenger that was going to fly the plane. And now, after they had landed, they encountered a woman smuggling drugs and a dead baby. What was the connection between the urban legends and the end of the world? Hopefully John would get the answers which Dashwood promised when the fifth member of their team arrived. It was actually someone John already knew, since he was kind of a go-between when connecting people from heaven to earth, but also the inventor of electricity. That's right, it was Benjamin Franklin. Franklin and Dashwood tell John they needed him to repair reality by traveling the globe patching the holes. To accomplish this, he would need some sort of magical talisman, which he did not bring like he was supposed to. All he had on him was a cigarette lighter, which reminded him he needed more, and told the two spirits he'd be back a little later. On his way back to the hotel, John is grabbed and thrown into the back of a taxi with a driver most of you may recognize. I thought that was a cool little cameo. The young man in the back explains that his name was Mordecai the Bean Eater and was part of a disorganized religion called the Church of Virtual Reality. John really didn't seem bothered by how weird this all was, but I guess his curiosity wanted to see where this all led, which happened to be a bar. At a table at the back of the bar sat their leader, or at least the higher up. She says to Constantine that she knows what's actually going on, that basically it's more complicated than what little Dashwood had told him. She continued to explain that it was a virus, that she dubbed the Everything Virus. Like other viruses, it invades living cells and exploits complex machinery to make more. To achieve this, it will use the very cells it invades, which she believed was what was happening to everything, and it was a fate worse than death. Mordecai interjects, explaining that the first stage was phony systems infiltrating the regular ones, which were the urban legends John kept seeing. That then starts a conversation about viruses for a while, until John brings the topic back to the main mission at hand. Not that he thinks this whole thing makes sense or anything, but wanted to know what the solution would be regardless. The church leader explains it would require finding some kind of drug in the 98.6% of unexplored Brazilian flora, which was probably the dumbest thing John had ever heard. He was done here, and gets up to leave, while the three followed in tow, all the while trying to convince Constantine that this was serious and not a joke. Eris, another church member, spots something headed down the street. John turns and confirms the person to be the cat demon Manar, brandishing a weapon. Right away he knew this was bad and tried to warn the three church members, but it was like his feet were in cement and his body was in slow motion. Just then, Manar reaches them, draws his sword and decapitated Mordecai with one clean swipe. He then looks at John and says he would handle the bleeding if John could handle the binding, while the blood from Mordecai's neck poured onto Constantine in slow motion. We then fast forward to John, Manar, and Dashwood at the airport. Usually Constantine would have just used illusion magic to forge whatever paperwork he needed, including tickets. But that doesn't work if the plane was full, so he had to resort to stealing some poor guy's tickets and passports, one for him and one for Manar. As they boarded the plane, John kept thinking about Dashwood and the Hellfire Club, and how, for hundreds of years, they had pulled the strings of major events, jerking their puppets around to suit their own needs. Was John one of those puppets now? The thought gnawed at the back of his mind, but guessed he really didn't have any other choice but to bide his time until he could figure out what was really going on. Unfortunately, nothing could prepare him for what came next. The passengers and their organs began to flip inside out, which started a panic throughout the entire plane, causing it to descend rapidly. But thankfully someone, Constantine didn't know who, but someone had enough intellect to land the plane in North Australia, saving everybody. After the shock had worn off, John began to relax and sat on a rock near the plane to have a smoke, when he saw someone approaching in the distance. At first glance, he thought it was another inside-out passenger, but as the person moved closer, he saw the face paint and realized it was a witch doctor. John knew this couldn't be good. The witch doctor walked over to Manar, pointed his stick at him, and let out a loud scream, more than likely cursing the cat demon. At that same moment, the plane exploded, but luckily, everyone had already moved away from it. The witch doctor had disappeared, which was unfortunate for Manar. John told him he needed to get that stick, so Manar and Dashwood split up to search while John talked to the locals. What he found out was, apparently the witch doctor's name was Jeffo, and had been out there for 4 days, like he was waiting for something to happen. At that moment, John realized everywhere he had gone, there had been some sort of prophet of doom, starting the night he had dropped in on his fortune teller friend Rose. In her crystal ball, he had witnessed reality being torn apart, while 2 people chased him. Rose thought he was crazy. She never saw a thing. Hell, John hadn't even touched the crystal ball yet. But that vision, it led to Uncle Arthur and the urban legends, all the way to the witch doctor. Oh, and speaking of Jeffo, John and the locals headed to a bar since it would be hours before help arrived. Constantine sat down at the front bar, lit his cigarette, and looks over to see none other than the witch doctor Jeffo. John told him to be careful with that cat-faced bastard, but the witch doctor didn't seem too worried. He says that his soul had gone on a walkabout with the rainbow snake, then gets up and leaves. John continues chatting it up with the locals for a while, when it hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't the apocalypse or reality coming undone. Everything that's gone wrong had went that way when Dashwood was there. The only thing he wasn't sure of was if Manar was oblivious to it all. But if he had to guess, Manar was using Dashwood for his own ends, since he was always the one putting the mission back on course. Meanwhile, Manar had tracked down Jeffo and was waiting for him at his house. But the witch doctor was smart. He had hidden his stick somewhere it would never be found, and a chase then ensues. The witch doctor led Manar to a forest and into a trap. He unleashed a gigantic anaconda, and a long brutal battle took place, eventually leading to Manar being caught off guard by a lightning bolt, more than likely due to the curse put upon him. The next morning, his body was found by the locals John was hanging with. Now, checking back in with Constantine. Now that he knew Dashwood was behind reality coming apart, he needed to get him as far away from everything as possible. He then remembered what the church leader had said about a cure being in the Brazilian rainforest. Even if it wasn't a cure there, it was far away from everything, in the perfect place to lure Dashwood. So he hitched a ride to the docks. There he found a boat that shipped supplies to an island in the middle of nowhere once a week, and hitched another ride. Nothing weird had happened in a while, so he figured Dashwood wasn't anywhere near yet. If he didn't take the bait, John thought he could just settle down with one of the local women or something, until they were almost at the island. An old wrecked P-40 plane that had been stuck on the top of the mountain for who knows how long came alive and crashed into the boat, completely destroying it. Obviously Dashwood did this, and was close now. John had to get up the mountain and fast, but would never make it without a guide. The captain insisted on going with him. She knew the terrain better than anyone. John knew she was right, so he didn't fight her on it too hard. A little while into their journey, the two came upon a village and decided to stay the night. The natives were more than happy to have them, especially the kids. They were curious and crowded around the two new visitors. Just around the time John was having second thoughts about all this, playing with the children reminded him why he was. That night, John was attacked once again. He felt a dark presence all around him. It began to take shape into the form of insects and started to fill his lungs. He choked and coughed as the boat captain rushed outside, running into and knocking him over, making him vomit up all the insects. The two got to their feet and noticed that the village was unusually quiet. They looked around and saw that all the villagers had seemingly vanished, but on the ground near their feet, John noticed a doll and a small path leading to a cave that held the village ancestors' burial remains. Despite their reservations, the two continued on. Hung around the cave were the skeletons of the long dead, but John found a more horrific sight on the ground further in. the entire village, including the children's murdered bodies. The boat captain asked why they were spared, and he replied, because it still needs us. Suddenly, Dashwood, having used the villagers to lure them to the cave, appears from the shadows. John wasn't sure if Dashwood was onto him or not, so he plays nice for the moment. He insisted that they continue their mission, but unfortunately for him, Constantine had other plans. He and the captain rushed back into the jungle. Once outside the cave, John asked for her knife, and the two split up. Confused as to what was going on, Dashwood gives chase, taking spiritual form to catch up faster, as John comes across a large tree and begins to cut magical symbols into it. He then covers where he carved with fluids and sets it on fire. He hoped he got this right because he didn't have time for a second chance. Dashwood finally catches up, and as he tries to pass through said tree, realizes that he was stuck. John had trapped him inside, and the only way he could escape would be if someone destroyed it. He couldn't imagine why Dashwood would want this power over reality, or why a spirit would even care about the living world in general. But regardless, he fooled Franklin and everybody else, if they weren't just figments created by Dashwood himself like John suspected. This is the end of Warped Notions and Eddie Campbell's run, but not the story exactly. There is still a small arc that is the beginning of Paul Jenkins' run that ties to Eddie Campbell's. Although Eddie's time with Constantine is short, it's nice to see that progression from Garth's run. You might remember at the end of that run, John seemed like he wanted to save people instead of let them die for no other reason than to get his thrills from fighting demons. We see that coming through a little within this story, with John leading Dashwood as far away as possible from civilization, and with one of the best moments from the story. The moment when he was having second thoughts, but sees the kids and realizes why he's doing all this. Even if those kids died anyway, he still tried, and seemed to see that some people are worth saving. Think of John when we first met him, or even the first Hellblazer arc. He sacrifices his own friend without even a second thought. Although I will say he felt somewhat bad, mainly because all his dead friends were haunting him. My point is, he's grown a lot thanks to all these wonderful writers. But anyway, moving on to the final story in this video, and the first mini arc in Paul Jenkins' take on the character. With Sean Phillips coming back to do the art, this story is called Dreamtime. And starts on issue 89, with John still in Australia sitting under a waterfall with Jeffo and the remaining Aborigines, preparing to enter the invisible Dreamtime that connects the past, present, and future to meet with the Rainbow Snake, which you might remember was referenced in the previous story. The magic being used here was strong, probably stronger than any he had ever encountered, and believed he was in way over his head this time, but it was too late to be having second thoughts. Jeffo asked if John was ready, and hands him the didgeridoo, which was an instrument that would summon the Rainbow Snake to him. Jeffo also told him to listen to the waterfall because that's where the snake would emerge. When the music and the sound of the waterfall intersect, that's where the serpent would be. And to sing to her, tell her to forgive the white man, which is why John was doing all this anyway. The white men of the Outback were trying to kick the tribe off their own land, but we'll get into that more later. John begins to blow into the instrument, and right away feels the waterfall listening. The sound of the tribe becomes a sound of breathing, and the magic starts to take shape, suddenly realizing that everything he has known has just been snatched out from under him, and yet was also sensible and obvious, an idea as old as time. It was a seed. Everything came from a seed. The power of these seeds were called Guruwari. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. It's a song of the origin of every natural object. So now when Jeffo told him that the mountain was just an echo of the force that created it, John finally understood it so clearly. But he tries to tell himself it's all an illusion, that he's still in that rock in the forest, but didn't really believe it. He's suddenly startled by a bird on a nearby branch and a talking kangaroo. The kangaroo asked if he come to sing to the Rainbow Snake, and says to talk to the river. She was listening, and would lead him to the Rainbow Snake, but to be careful not to piss her off because she bites hard. The kangaroo then disappears and John jumps into the river. Almost right away he encounters the reason why he was there and wonders how he even got himself into this mess. It was actually 2 days ago. John had just trapped Dashwood in the tree and has now met back up with the boat captain, hoping he'd be able to get in her pants, when Jeffo appeared before them asking for help. John, as usual, didn't take much convincing. As much as he tells himself nowadays he's not, he really is always up for a good adventure. He follows Jeffo up a hill to a seemingly barren part of the island, and tells John that they were nearing the end of their first day. Tonight will be the dream of tomorrow. Constantine figured he was being tested, but for what exactly? The two stop for the night, and basically Jeffo explains everything about the dream time, which opened John up to being able to catch a glimpse of it. This was the first step of his journey. Eventually, he would be able to see what Jeffo saw. The next day, the two continue their journey. Jeffo still hadn't told John what the purpose of all this was, but now that he was able to see the dream time, Jeffo said he would be able to work it out for himself. That night, the two come across a dog with some kind of skin cancer from the looks of it. But in reality, it was a spiritual cancer brought on by the white man. They were turning the dream time into a nightmare. Jeffo then explains the white man showed up many years ago, killing and burning everything, thinking they owned the land with eyes and ears shut. It began to anger the rainbow snake, but has gotten much worse recently, with the white men not satisfied with the land they have and are trying to push the tribes further out. But even so, Jeffo and the rest of the tribe still feel bad for them and ask Constantine not to help the tribe, but the white man. By the time their talk was over, they had arrived at their destination and met with the tribe, but were interrupted by the so-called new owners of the land and her goons, guns in hand, telling the tribe they were trespassing. John could barely hold back his fury. Jeffo and the tribe may not want to fight back, but this was his specialty. The two had some heated exchanges, ending with the old bag threatening to shoot him. She then turns to Jeffo, telling him he has 2 weeks to vacate, and she will come back with 100 men if necessary. We then cut back to the present. The rainbow snake had grabbed John's ankle between her massive jaws. Her grip was strong enough to completely crush his leg, but he knew what she was doing. It was a warning. If she didn't like his song, his journey would end at the bottom of the river. She eventually lets go, letting John know it was time for him to state his case. He could feel her thoughts, her anger that bled into the visible world. They were saying to sing his forgiveness to her, but for some reason, that little devil on his shoulder thought he had a better plan. John then does something completely stupid. He tells the snake that he doesn't do request. She grabs him by the throat, and he could feel her grip slowly getting tighter and tighter. But because he had figured out her little trick, he wasn't a bit worried. You see, the rainbow snake couldn't hurt him. Her magic didn't extend to the white man. His actual body was still on that rock near the waterfall, and he could still feel what was going on there. John had stopped playing the instrument, and the tribe had stopped the ceremonial dance. They began watching him, wondering if their mighty song was working. But that's the trick. The whole reason she couldn't touch him. The tribe were the real power of the dream time. Without the dance, the snake was powerless. Therefore, she was never going to pull the land into the dream time. She didn't even know how. She fed those poor believers out there a bunch of nonsense and has them terrified of the apocalypse. Now, he could make them start dancing again. He would just have to start playing the instrument. The rainbow snake told him to go ahead, and she would listen to what he had to say. John tells her all those scary signs in the sky she made actually weren't scaring anybody, but for a price, he could help her out, and even throw in the old woman as a bonus. The serpent offers him the answer to any question throughout his world's history, and to prove it, the snake shows him visions of all the major events throughout time all at once. But John knew better than to take an apple from an untrustworthy serpent, so he just says she owed him one. John then re-emerges back in the waking world, with Jeffo standing over him. He knew Constantine was up to something. It was written all over his face, but he just said it was a little white man magic and began writing a letter, while the so-called new landowners were tired of waiting and began planning something. A few days later, Jeffo was getting a little worried. John had just been sitting around smoking for days. He wanted to know what they were waiting for and what was in that letter he sent off. Well, John had sent the letter to the rep of Aboriginal Affairs, using just the right kind of magic for the right kind of asshole, which meant he probably threatened them. But regardless, it worked. The old lady's hold on the land had been rejected. The only thing was, she didn't know it yet, and her men were getting impatient, waiting for the tribe to leave so they would be paid. So that same night, they all rolled up with beers and guns in hand, itching for a fight. John cracked a joke, but their leader was too drunk and out of patience. He hits John in the face with the butt of his gun, while yelling this was private property now. John wipes the blood from his mouth and asked if he was sure about that. I have a funny feeling your jurisdiction just got booted up the ass. The old lady wasn't believing any of it. She gave them all 2 minutes to leave before her men began to open fire. But the tribe had been here for 100,000 years and didn't plan on leaving without a fight. They began to dance their Dreamtime song, echoing back and forth across the river, resonating with its heartbeat. Their dance then begins to become more urgent as the Dreamtime invades the visible world. Before he saw it, John could feel the cold anger of the rainbow snake. He did what he told her he would. The rest was up to her. She strikes like lightning, fast and swift. One by one, they fall like flies. A few actually tried to fight back, but it was no use. They had no power here. It wasn't their land. John just sat back and watched as the carnage unfolded. Even if he wanted to stop it, he couldn't. Every Earth God demands a sacrifice once in a while. After she was done, John reminds the serpent that she owed him a really big one. She says she will let him know and disappears back into the river, taking the Dreamtime with her. Now it was time for him to leave as well. He hated tearful goodbyes anyway. But before he goes, he tells Jeffo to watch out for vampires in business suits. Jeffo replies that it was a little late for that. One's already been sniffing around by the river. John just says, yeah, that's the trouble with the white man's world. You claim a small victory and everybody wanted a piece. But not to worry because the lawyers are like serpent gods. They're all useless. This is the end of Dreamtime and the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you did. And I'll see you in the next video.